Keeping data safe these days, it's a huge challenge, right? Especially with all these hybrid and multi-cloud environments. It seems like every organization is dealing with that now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when your data is spread out all over the place, it just makes it that much harder to keep everything secure.
And that's why we're diving into this report today, the Understanding Data Security Risk 2025 Survey Report.
Mm-hmm.
It's from the Cloud Security Alliance and Tails.
Okay, yeah.
And what's really cool about it is they actually talk to like 912 real IT and security professionals.
Mm-hmm.
So, these are people who are dealing with this stuff every day.
So we're getting some real insights here. This isn't just theory.
Exactly. So what we want to do today is, unpack this report, pull out the big takeaways, and hopefully give you a better sense of where things stand right now with data security, risk management, that whole thing. Maybe point out a few things you might want to think about for your own organization.
Sounds good.
Okay, so the first thing that jumped out at me in this report was, it's kind of surprising. It's about how well organizations actually understand their data risk.
Yeah, a lot of people might assume everyone has a good handle on that, but that's not really what the survey found.
Yeah, and this is where it gets a little concerning, I guess. The report says that 31% of the people they talk to, they don't even have the tools to figure out where their riskiest data is.
Wow.
And then on top of that, another 12% said they weren't even sure if they had the right tools.
So you're saying basically almost a third of these organizations, they're just operating in the dark when it comes to their most sensitive data.
That's exactly what it sounds like. I mean, how do you protect something if you don't even know where it is or what it is?
Yeah.
It's a huge blind spot.
It is. And the thing is, a lot of these organizations, they know they have a problem. The report says that 80% of them, they said they don't feel super confident about their ability to identify high-risk data sources. And, many of them are already using a bunch of different tools, like 4 or more, to try and manage this risk.
So that begs the question, is it a matter of having too many tools and they're just not talking to each other? Or do they just not have the right tools in the first place?
Yeah, it's like having a toolbox full of hammers when what you really need is a screwdriver.
Exactly. And you have to factor in the environments these organizations are working in, right? They're complicated. For bigger companies, those with more than 10,000 employees, over half of them are dealing with hybrid cloud setups. And then 27% are juggling multi-cloud environments.
Right. So imagine trying to keep track of all your important data when it's spread across all these different platforms. It's a nightmare.
Yeah, it's like trying to keep track of all your valuables when they're scattered across a bunch of different houses. You need a good inventory system, and you need to know what's valuable in the first place.
Totally. The report actually asks people, what helps them the most when they're trying to understand their data risk.
Oh, that's interesting. So what did they say?
Well, it seems like the most useful things are clear assessment results. Like, after they do a risk assessment, they need those results to be easy to understand.
That makes sense.
And then dedicated dashboards where they can see all their risk information in one place, a single pane of glass view.
So they can see the big picture.
Exactly. And then the third thing is risk scores. They need some way to quantify the risk so they can prioritize.
Okay, so basically they need to know what's risky, where it is, and how risky it is.
Yeah, that's the gist of it.
Makes perfect sense to me. All right, so we've talked about visibility, or the lack thereof, as a big challenge. What else did the report highlight?
Well, the next thing is kind of a communication breakdown, really. It's about how differently management and staff perceive security priorities. And this has some real implications for how organizations develop their risk and compliance strategies.
So that sounds like a recipe for trouble. When you've got different levels of an organization not on the same page about security, things can slip through the cracks.
Definitely. So here's what they found. Only 20% of staff think that their CISOs are really focused on getting executives to invest in security.
Okay.
But then when you ask management, 34% of them think that CISOs are prioritizing that.
So there's a pretty big difference there. I mean, either management thinks they're doing a better job advocating for security than their staff believes, or maybe they just aren't communicating it down the chain effectively.
Exactly. And that disconnect, it leads to some real issues with confidence. Staff are way more likely to say they have absolutely no confidence in their ability to find those high-risk data sources. It was 10% of staff compared to just 3% of management who felt that way.
That's really telling, isn't it? If the people who are working with the data every day don't feel like security is a top priority for their bosses, they're probably not going to be as careful or as proactive in spotting potential problems.
Right. And the report goes on to talk about some of the operational challenges that contribute to this, things like just not having enough people to do the work. 48% of respondents said they were struggling with limited staffing.
Yeah, that's a common problem.
And then 46% pointed to a lack of automation. They're still doing way too much manually.
Okay, so not enough people and too much manual work. That just sounds like a recipe for always being behind the curve.
It is, and it gets worse. More than half, 54%, are relying on semi-automated processes for evaluating risk, and almost a quarter, 22%, are still doing it completely manually.
Wait, they're still using spreadsheets and stuff to try to manage risk in this day and age?
Apparently, yeah.
That's just crazy inefficient.
Yeah.
You can't keep up with today's threats if you're stuck in the Stone Age with your processes.
Agreed. It just makes everything harder.
Okay, so we've got gaps in understanding, we've got misaligned priorities between management and staff. What about the tools? Are the tools helping at all?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. This is the third key finding from the report. It's all about how the tools are struggling to keep up with the demands of, managing risk in today's complex IT environments. And remember how we talked about how organizations are using a bunch of different tools?
Yeah, like 4 or more.
Well, it turns out that having all these tools, it can actually make things worse.
How so? You'd think more tools would equal more security.
You would, but it's not that simple. The report found that all these different tools, they often lead to bad decisions and what they call siloed processes.
So the tools aren't talking to each other.
Oh, yeah.
Classic tool sprawl.
Yep, exactly. It's like having a bunch of different security cameras, but none of them are connected to a central monitoring system. You get a fragmented view.
Yeah, you can't see the whole picture.
Right. And the report, it specifically mentions how important tools like data loss prevention, DLP threat detection, and encryption still are. Over half of the organizations are using DLP and encryption, and almost half are using threat detection.
Which makes sense. Those are kind of the foundational elements of security, right?
Absolutely. But the problem is a lot of times those tools are operating in isolation. They're not integrated. So you don't get that holistic view of what's really going on. And this is especially a problem in those complex hybrid and multi-cloud environments we were talking about before.
Because the more spread out your data is, the more important it is to have all your security tools working together.
Precisely.
Okay, so the tools themselves aren't necessarily the problem. It's how they're being used.
That seems to be a big part of it.
Sure.
Now, there's another interesting piece to this whole puzzle. The report looked at what's really motivating organizations to try and reduce risk in the first place.
Okay, what's the driving force behind all of this?
Turns out the biggest factor is regulations and compliance mandates. 59% of those surveyed said that was their main reason for focusing on risk reduction. Things like ISO standards, GDPR, PCI, DSS, all those fun acronyms.
So a lot of organizations are primarily focused on checking the compliance boxes and avoiding those hefty fines.
It seems that way, yeah.
But does that really mean they have a good security posture?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's what this fourth key finding is all about. The report suggests that even though regulations and compliance are pushing organizations to reduce risk, it doesn't necessarily translate into a proactive security strategy. They're focused on meeting the minimum requirements, not on anticipating new threats and staying ahead of the curve.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in that compliance mindset and lose sight of the bigger picture. It's like you're so focused on locking the front door that you forget to check the windows.
Exactly. And the report points out some specific areas where organizations are falling short in terms of proactive security. For example, only 11% said they prioritize identifying risky user behavior.
Okay, so insider threats are not getting enough attention.
Not really, no. And only 12% said they focus on adapting their security to the changing attack surface.
So they're not really thinking about how the threats themselves are evolving. That seems like a big oversight.
It is. And then there's the question of how quickly they can react to new risks. Only 15% said they do real-time risk evaluations.
You okay? That's a long time in the world of cybersecurity. A lot can happen in a week.
It can. So the report is basically saying that organizations need to get a lot faster and more proactive when it comes to risk assessment.
Okay, so the need for a more dynamic approach to risk management.
Exactly. And that brings us to the last key finding, which is about the shift towards risk-based strategies. It seems like more and more organizations are starting to realize they need to move beyond just compliance and start thinking more strategically about risk.
So moving from a reactive to a proactive approach, basically. What does that look like in practice?
Well, according to the report, when they asked respondents about their top priorities for the next year, the two things that came out on top were identifying vulnerabilities and then figuring out how to prioritize fixing those vulnerabilities.
Okay, that makes sense. You need to know what your weaknesses are before you can fix them.
Exactly. And they need a way to figure out which vulnerabilities pose the biggest risk so they can focus their efforts where it matters most.
So what are they using to figure out how risky things are?
The top three indicators they mentioned were their vulnerability patch rate, how quickly they're fixing known vulnerabilities, then the number of security violations they're seeing, and then compliance violations. Each of those was tracked by about a third of the respondents.
Okay, so they're looking at how well they're patching things, how many security incidents they're having, and whether or not they're meeting their compliance requirements. That all seems pretty logical.
It does. And the report also asked how they plan to spend their risk management budgets.
What were the top priorities there?
The biggest one was staff training, which makes a lot of sense. 65% said they were planning to invest in that.
You got to have people who know what they're doing.
Absolutely. And then streamlining processes was next at 51%.
So making things more efficient, less manual work.
Right. And then the third one was consolidating tools, which came in at 47%.
So trying to reduce that tool sprawl and get a more unified view of their security posture.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's step back and look at the big picture here for a second. We've talked about how many organizations are struggling to really understand their data risks. We've seen that there's often a disconnect between management and staff about security priorities. We've talked about how having too many tools can actually make things worse, and how the focus on compliance can sometimes get in the way of a truly proactive security strategy. But it seems like there's hope, right? It sounds like organizations are starting to recognize the need for a more risk-based approach.
That's a great summary. I think you hit all the key points. The big themes here are definitely the need for better risk understanding, better communication between teams, making better use of the tools that are already out there, and moving towards a more proactive, risk-based approach. And underpinning all of that is communication.
Communication is key. You can't fix any of these problems if you're not talking to each other.
Exactly.
Right? So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a question, something to think about. We've talked about a lot of challenges today. So what's one thing that you can do in your organization right now to better understand and manage your own data security risks? Maybe it's about taking a fresh look at how you identify and categorize your most important data. Or maybe it's about starting a conversation with your team about how they view security priorities. Whatever it is, it's important to take that first step.
That's a really great question. And, I think this report provides a valuable benchmark for everyone to measure themselves against. It's a good way to assess your own security posture and identify areas where you can improve.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We hope this has given you some valuable food for thought.
Absolutely.
And we encourage you to keep learning and to keep working to protect your organization's valuable data.
Thanks for having me. This was a great discussion.
Thanks for being here.